My name is Emma Carter. I'm 34 years old, and the last time I spoke to my parents, I was lying on a hospital gurney at 11 p.m., bleeding through a pair of navy scrubs. I had just worked a 10-hour shift in trying to keep my voice steady, while a doctor I had never met told me I needed emergency surgery or I might not make it through the night. And I remember gripping my phone so hard my fingers went numb because I knew exactly who I had to call first, even though a part of me already knew how it would go, but hope has a way of making you do stupid things. So I hit my mom's name and held the phone to my ear while the nurse pressed gauze against my abdomen and asked me if there was someone on the way. And when my mother picked up, I could hear music in the background, glasses clinking, people laughing, the kind of loud, polished noise that only happens at a party where everything has been planned down to the napkin color. And I said, "Mom, I'm in the ER. They're taking me into surgery. I'm scared. Can you come?" And there was a pause, not a shocked pause, not a worried pause, just a brief inconvenience in her evening. And then she sighed, actually sighed, like I had just asked her to pick me up from the airport at a bad time. And she said, "Emma, I can't just leave right now. There are people here. Ashley's engagement party has 50 guests. You'll be fine. The doctors know what they're doing. Stop being dramatic." And I remember pulling the phone away from my ear for a second because I needed to make sure I had heard her correctly. Because there are moments in your life where your brain refuses to process what's happening in real time. And this was one of them. And in the background, I heard my sister's voice, sharp and annoyed, asking who it was. And my mom lowered her voice like I was the problem, like I was interrupting something important. And she said, "I'll call you tomorrow. Okay, just rest." And then she hung up and that was it. "No, are you okay? No, I'm coming. No, stay on the phone with me." Just a clean, quiet disconnect while I was still trying to figure out if I was about to lose my life and the baby I hadn't even told anyone else about yet. And I stood there for a second, staring at my phone like it might ring back, like she might realize what she had just done and fix it, but it didn't. And the nurse Karen, I still remember her name because she was the only person in that room who looked at me like I mattered, gently took the phone out of my hand and said, "We need to go now." And I nodded because what else was I supposed to do? And as they wheeled me down the hallway under those bright fluorescent lights that make everything feel colder than it is, I kept thinking about how I had spent my entire life trying to be the easy child, the one who didn't ask for much, the one who adjusted schedule her plans, her expectations, so everything would run smoothly for everyone else, especially for my sister, because in my family Ashley was the center of gravity, and the rest of us just orbited around whatever she needed at the time. And somehow, even in that moment, bleeding and scared and alone, part of me was still trying to justify it, telling myself maybe it really was a bad time. Maybe she couldn't leave. Maybe I was overreacting, which is funny when you think about it because it takes a special kind of conditioning to convince yourself you're overreacting while you're being prepped for emergency surgery. And then they stopped the BL gurney outside the operating room, and Karen leaned over me and squeezed my hand and said, "You're not alone. I'm right here." And I almost laughed because a stranger had just said the exact thing I needed to hear, and the one person who was supposed to say it couldn't be bothered. And then the anesthesiologist told me to count backward from 10, and I didn't even make it to 7 before everything went black. And when I woke up, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't just fill a room but settles into your chest. And I knew before anyone said anything that the baby was gone. And I turned my head expecting to see someone sitting there, even though I had no reason to expect that anymore. But habits die hard, and the chair by the window was empty. No flowers, no bag of personal items, no familiar voice asking how I felt, just a machine beeping steadily and a nurse checking my vitals like it was any other night. And I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles, counting the tiny cracks between them, because it was easier than thinking about the fact that I had just gone through one of the worst moments of my life, completely alone. And 3 days later, when my phone finally rang again, and I saw my phone, a mother's name on the screen, I answered it because some part kind of me still hadn't learned, and the first thing she said wasn't, "How are you?" or "What did the doctor say it was?" I hope you're not going to use this to guilt trip anyone. The party went beautifully, by the way, And I remember sitting there in that hospital bed IV still in my arm, realizing that whatever I had been holding on to my entire life, whatever version of a mother I thought I had, didn't exist, not in any way that mattered. And I said, I'm here because I didn't have the energy for anything else. And then I hung up, and that was the last time I spoke to my parents. I didn't sleep that night. Not really, just lay there listening to the machines and thinking about how none of this had actually started in that hospital room, because if I'm honest, the pattern was already set years before I ever picked up that phone, and I grew up in a house where everything looked normal. From the outside, 2-story place, clean lawn, family dinners at 6, but inside it ran on a very clear system that nobody ever said out loud. My older sister Ashley was the center of everything, and I was the adjustment everyone else made to keep things running smoothly. And it wasn't always obvious if you didn't know what to look for. It showed up in small decisions like whose schedule mattered and whose didn't, whose milestones got celebrated, and whose got acknowledged with a quick "that's nice" before the conversation moved on. I remember the day I graduated from nursing school, top of my class, 3 job offers lined up. I called my mom because that's what you're supposed to do. You share good news with your family, and she answered on the 4th ring, and I said I did it. I graduated, and there was a pause, and then she said, "That's nice, honey. Listen, can you switch your shift on Saturday? Ashley has a dress fitting, and I have my book club," and I said yes. Of course I said yes, because that's what I had always done. I made it work. I rearranged things. I told myself it didn't matter. That being flexible meant being strong. But over time, you start to realize flexibility in one person just becomes convenience for everyone else. And Ashley, she wasn't a villain, not in the cartoon sense. She was just used to being prioritized. My mom treated her life like a running highlight reel, posting everything online, her engagement, her house, her hair appointments, like they were major events. Every caption, the same tone, proud, glowing, like she was managing a brand. And I don't think I ever showed up on that page, not once, not even when I finished school. And you notice things like that, even if you pretend you don't. And my dad, David, he was always there, physically home at the same time. Every day sat at the same spot at the table, listened to baseball on a small radio in the garage after dinner. But when it came to anything that mattered, anything that required choosing a side or even just speaking up, he stayed quiet. And I used to watch him during dinners when my mom would cut me off mid-sentence or redirect the conversation back to Ashley. And he'd look at me just for a second, like he wanted to say something, like he knew it wasn't right. But then he'd go back to his plate, and that look, that almost apology without words, it did something to you. It teaches you that even the people who care about you might not protect you. And I think that's worse than outright rejection, because it keeps you hoping. It keeps you waiting for the moment. They finally step in and say, enough, and that moment never comes. So you learn to lower your expectations in small, quiet ways. You stop sharing things. You stop asking for help. You become the person who handles everything on your own because it feels easier than being disappointed again. And by the time I was in my 20s, that role was so ingrained I didn't even question it anymore. I just lived it. I worked hard, picked up extra shifts, kept my life simple and out of the way. And every now and then there'd be a moment where it almost felt like things could be different. Like maybe my mom would ask how I was doing and actually listen, or my dad would say something that shifted the balance even a little. But those moments never lasted. They'd snap back into the same pattern like a rubber band. And I kept telling myself that if I just did enough, if I just proved I was responsible, capable, easy to deal with, eventually they'd see me the way they saw Ashley. But that's not how it works, because favoritism isn't about merit, it's about habit. It's about a story people decide to believe and then reinforce over and over until it feels like truth. And in our house, the story was that Ashley needed support and attention, and I was fine on my own. And once that narrative sets in, everything gets filtered through it. If Ashley needed help, it was urgent. If I needed help, it was optional. If Ashley made a mistake, it was understandable. If I struggled, it was something I should handle quietly. And my dad, he let that story play out without ever challenging it. And I don't think it was because he didn't care. I think it was because he was afraid of disrupting the system afraid of conflict. And when you grow up watching that, you internalize it. You start believing that keeping the peace is more important than being treated fairly. And that belief follows you into adulthood. It shapes your decisions in ways you don't even realize until something breaks the pattern hard enough that you can't ignore it anymore. And for me, that breaking point didn't come out of nowhere. It was built on years of being the one who adjusted, the one who waited, the one who hoped things would change without anyone actually doing anything to change them. So when I found myself alone in that hospital calling for help and being told I was an inconvenience, it wasn't just about that moment. It was the confirmation of everything that had been happening all along, just louder, clearer, impossible to explain away, and looking back. Now I can see the warning signs were always there in every conversation that got redirected, every achievement that got minimized, every silence from my dad when it mattered most. But when you're living inside that kind of dynamic, you don't call it favoritism, you call it normal, because it's all you've ever known. And by the time you realize it isn't normal, you've already built your life around surviving it. I was sitting on the bathroom floor when I found out, still in my scrubs back against the cabinet, staring at a plastic test like it might change its mind if I gave it enough time. And I remember checking the date on my phone twice because I needed to be sure I wasn't miscounting. But the math didn't lie. 10 weeks, maybe a little more, and the first thought that hit me wasn't excitement or panic, it was silence. The kind where everything slows down and you realize you're about to make a decision that nobody else is going to help you with. Because 3 weeks earlier, the man who was supposed to be part of this had packed a bag while I was working a double shift, left a one-word text that said sorry, and blocked my number like that, closed the situation, no conversation, no explanation, just gone. And I won't pretend that didn't sting. It did. But by that point in my life, I was already used to people disappearing when things got inconvenient, so I didn't chase him. I didn't call from another number. I didn't show up at his door. I just sat there on that bathroom floor and asked myself a very simple question: can I do this alone? And the answer came faster than I expected. Yes, not because it would be easy, but because I had been doing hard things my entire life without anyone stepping in to make them easier. And once I said that out loud, even just to myself, something settled, not comfort exactly, but clarity. And that was enough to stand up, wash my face, and start thinking about what came next. And the first person I called, because again, I hadn't learned yet, was my mother. I stood in my kitchen holding my phone, watching the screen light up as it rang. And when she answered, I didn't ease into it. I said, "Mom, I need to tell you something, I'm pregnant." And there was a pause on the other end. Not shock, not concern, just calculation. And then she said, "Are you sure this is the right time? Ashley's wedding is in 3 months, and I don't want anything overshadowing it." And I remember looking around my apartment at the sink, full of dishes I hadn't gotten to yet, at the stack of unopened mail on the counter, trying to process how we had moved from me, telling her I was carrying a child to her, worrying about a wedding timeline in less than 10 seconds. And I said, "I understand," because that was still my default setting. Minimize yourself, keep things smooth, don't push back. And she didn't ask how I felt, didn't ask who the father was, didn't ask if I needed anything. She just said we'd talk later and hung up, and that should have been the moment I adjusted my expectations. But I told myself she just needed time, that maybe she was surprised that she'd call back with something warmer once she had processed it, but the call never came. The only person who reached out that week was my Aunt Diane, who said, "Congratulations, you're going to be a great mom." And I remember sitting on my couch after that call crying harder than I had when I saw the test, because sometimes it's not the big reactions that break you, it's the small, genuine ones that show you what you've been missing. And from there, I started planning quietly. I looked into prenatal care options, adjusted my budget, picked up extra shifts, not because I was panicking, but because I knew exactly how this would go. There would be no safety net, no one stepping in if things got difficult, so I built my own piece by piece. And there were moments, small ones, where I let myself imagine what it might be like holding a baby in my apartment, figuring it out day by day. Not perfect, not easy, but mine, and those moments mattered because they gave me something to move towards, something that wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. But at the same time, the gap between that vision and my reality kept getting clearer, especially when it came to my family. My mom started calling more often, but not about me, about Ashley's wedding, the seating chart, the dress fittings, the guest list, like nothing had changed, like I hadn't just told her, something that should have shifted the entire conversation, and I'd stand there on the phone listening to details about floral arrangements while my other hand rested on my stomach, thinking this is really how this is going to be, isn't it? And every time I thought about bringing it up again, asking for something more, even just basic acknowledgement, I stopped myself because I already knew the answer, and there's a point where asking for something you know you won't get starts to, I feel like volunteering for disappointment, so I didn't ask. I just kept moving forward, one appointment at a time, one shift at a time, telling myself that I didn't need their support, that I could do this on my own. And on paper, that was true. I had a job, I had a plan, I had the kind of discipline that comes from years of being the responsible one. But emotionally, it was different, because no matter how independent you are, there's still a part of you that expects your family to show up when it matters. And every day that passed without that happening raised the stakes a little higher, because it meant that if something went wrong, really wrong, there would be no one to call, no one to come sit with you in a waiting room, no one to say you're not alone. And I wish I could say I prepared for that reality in a clean, logical way, but I didn't. I just pushed it to the side, focused on what I could control, because that's what I had always done. And for a while it worked until it didn't. I was standing in my kitchen heating up a can of soup when the pain hit sharp and low, like someone had flipped a switch inside my body without warning. And I remember gripping the edge of the counter waiting for it to pass, because that's what you do at first. You assume it's temporary, manageable, something you can push through. But it didn't ease up. It got worse fast, the kind of pain that makes your vision narrow and your breathing shallow. And within minutes, I knew this wasn't something I could wait out, so I grabbed my keys, didn't even bother changing out of my scrubs, and drove myself to the ER, hands tight on the wheel, every bump in the road hitting harder than it should. And by the time I pulled into the parking lot, I could feel something was very wrong, in a way that didn't leave room for denial. I walked through the sliding doors and made it halfway to the desk before I had to stop, because I could feel blood soaking through my pants, and everything after that moved quickly, but not in a way that felt rushed, more like a series of steps that had already been decided for me. Questions, vitals, someone calling for a doctor, and then I was on a gurney staring up at those same bright lights I'd worked under 100 times, except this time I wasn't the one in control. And a doctor leaned over me and said the words, "ruptured ectopic pregnancy," in that calm, practiced tone that tells you the situation is serious without saying it outright. And then, "We need to operate now." And I nodded, because there wasn't really another option. And when he asked if there was someone they could call, I didn't hesitate. I reached for my phone and called my mother, and I've already told you how that went. The music in the background, the laughter, the sigh. The words "stop being dramatic," and even now, saying it out loud, it still sounds like something that shouldn't fit in that moment, but it did perfectly, because it was exactly who she had always been when something important to me collided with something important to Ashley. And after she hung up, I just lay there for a second, staring at the ceiling, not crying, not panicking, just still, because something inside me had shifted in a way that felt permanent. It's like a door closing quietly instead of slamming shut. And then Karen, the nurse, took my hand and told me I wasn't alone, and I wanted to believe her. I really did. But there's a difference between not being physically alone and knowing the people who are supposed to show up for you chose not to, and I felt that difference all the way down to my bones. As they wheeled me into the operating room, the air colder, the lights brighter, the sounds more clinical, metal instruments, quiet voices, the anesthesiologist telling me to count backward, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment where everything changes, not just because of the surgery, but because of what just happened on that phone call. And then everything went dark. And when I woke up, it was quiet again, that same heavy quiet, and I didn't need anyone to explain it to me. I knew the baby was gone before anyone said the words, because sometimes your body understands things before your mind catches up. And I turned my head toward the chair by the window, out of habit, and it was empty. just like it had been in every version of this moment I had imagined differently. And that's when it really hit me, not just the loss, but the absence, the complete, undeniable absence of the people who were supposed to be there. And I lay there staring at the ceiling for a long time, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because there was no one to say it to. And over the next couple of days, nurses came and went, doctors checked in charts, got updated, everything functioned exactly the way it was supposed to, except for the part where family shows up. That part just didn't happen. And 3 days later when my phone rang, and it was my mother again, I answered because I needed to hear something different. I needed some sign that maybe she understood what had happened. And instead she said, "I hope you're not going to use this to guilt trip anyone." The party went beautifully. And that was the moment, not the surgery, not the diagnosis. That was the moment everything became clear, because there was no confusion left, no room for interpretation, just a straight line between who I thought she might be and who she actually was. And I didn't argue, I didn't explain, I didn't try to make her understand. I just said I'm here and hung up. And after that, I sat there in that hospital bed and made a decision that felt less like a reaction and more like a correction. I wasn't going to keep reaching for something that had never reached back. I wasn't going to keep adjusting myself to fit into a space where I clearly didn't belong, so I changed my phone number that afternoon, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I deactivated my social media filled-out transfer paperwork with the help of a hospital, social worker, and within 2 weeks, I had moved 4 hours away to a town where nobody knew my last name, nobody knew my family. Nobody expected me to play a role. I had been stuck in my entire life, and I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't leave a note, because there was nothing left to explain. They already knew what they had done. Whether they chose to admit it or not wasn't my responsibility anymore. And I remember driving away from that town with everything I owned packed into the back of my car, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief exactly, but space. Like I could finally breathe without waiting for someone else to decide if I was allowed to. And I didn't look back, not because I was trying to be strong or dramatic, but because for the first time in my life, walking away wasn't giving up. It was the only decision that made sense. I was halfway through a double shift when the letter showed up tucked between a stack of clinic notices and a grocery flyer in my mailbox, and I almost didn't open it because I had made a rule for myself about anything connected to my old life. But the return address said Diane Miller, and she was the blackest one person I hadn't cut off completely. The one who had called me when no one else did. So I stood there in the hallway outside my apartment, still in my scrubs, keys in one hand, envelope in the other, and decided to read it before I talked myself out of it. And the first few lines were exactly what I expected. Warm, careful, checking in without pushing, telling me she was proud of me, and for a second I let myself relax. Because it felt normal, like a simple connection that didn't come with a catch. But then the tone shifted just enough that I felt it before I fully understood it, and she wrote, "I need you to know what's being said about you." And I remember leaning back against the wall, because something in that sentence told me this wasn't going to be small. And she went on to explain that my mother had been telling people I didn't just leave, that I had some kind of mental health crisis, that I had been diagnosed with a severe personality disorder, that I was unstable, dangerous, and had disappeared in the middle of the night without warning. And I read that part twice because it didn't make sense at first. Not because it was complicated, but because it was so far from the truth. It felt like reading about a completely different person, and then it started to click. Not the facts, but the strategy. Because this wasn't random. This was controlled, intentional. The kind of story you tell when you need to protect your image more than you care about the person you're talking about. And my mother had always cared about how things looked, how they were presented, how they were received. So instead of explaining that her daughter had cut contact after being left alone in a hospital during a medical emergency, she created a version where she was the concerned parent and I was the unstable one who walked away. And once you understand that, everything else falls into place, because people are much more comfortable believing a clean, organized story than a messy, uncomfortable truth. And according to Diane, my mother didn't just tell this story in passing, she formalized it. She wrote a letter to Pastor Williams at Grace Community Church, laid everything out in careful, polished language that sounded compassionate on the surface, but painted me as someone who needed to be managed from a distance. And the letter made its way through the congregation, not officially, but the porty in two, the way these things always do quietly, through conversations after service, prayer requests, concerned looks, and suddenly I wasn't just absent, I was a cautionary example, the daughter people prayed for, without ever questioning why no one had actually reached out to me. And Diane wrote that my mother had started hosting monthly family dinners where she would pause before the meal and ask everyone to bow their heads and pray for me, for my healing, for my return. And I had to stop reading for a minute at that point because there's something deeply unsettling about being turned into a story people tell themselves to feel better about a situation they don't fully understand, especially when that story erases the part where you had a valid reason to leave. And what hit me hardest wasn't just that she lied, it was how believable the lie was because it fit into a pattern people already accepted. The quiet daughter who handled everything on her own, suddenly becoming unstable, wasn't that hard for them to accept, and the confident, organized mother, stepping into a role of concern, fit perfectly with how she had always presented herself. So the narrative stuck, and according to Diane, most of the family believed it without question. Some of them tried to reach out early on, but stopped when they didn't get a response. Others didn't try at all, because they assumed distance was part of the situation, and over time, the story settled into something solid, something people repeated without checking, because once a version of events gets enough traction, stops feeling like a version and starts feeling like the truth. And I sat there in my apartment with that letter in my hands, realizing that while I had spent the last couple of years rebuilding my life quietly focusing on my work, my education, my own stability, my mother had been actively reconstructing my absence into something that made sense for her, something that protected her position in the family and in the community. And there was a part of me that wanted to react, to call someone to correct it, to explain what had actually happened. But I didn't. And not because I didn't care, but because I understood something very clearly in that moment. The kind of clarity that only comes after you've been through enough to recognize patterns. If I stepped back into that system to defend myself, I would be stepping back into the same dynamic I had just fought to get out of, explaining, justifying, trying to be heard by people who had already chosen what they believed. And that wasn't a fight I was going to win, not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't playing the same game anymore. So I folded the letter carefully, set it on the table, and made a decision that felt quiet but firm. I was going to let them believe whatever they needed to believe because my life didn't exist in that space anymore. I didn't need their version of me to match mine in order to move forward. And over the next few weeks, I thought about it less and less, not because it didn't matter, but because I had built something that required my attention more than their opinions did. My job, my patients, my studies, my routines, all of it grounded me in a reality that was based on what I did, not what someone said about me. And every time the thought came back, the idea that somewhere out there people were talking about me like I was broken or unstable, I reminded myself of something simple: the people who needed to understand. The truth would either find it or they wouldn't, and I wasn't responsible for managing that outcome, and for the first time in my life, I was okay with that. I threw myself into work because it was the only thing in my life that still followed a set of rules I could trust. You show up, you do the job, you get results. No guessing, no emotional negotiations, just cause and effect. And after I moved to that small town nobody knew me in, I signed up for every shift. They would give me nights, weekends, holidays, the ones everyone else tried to avoid. Because being busy was easier than sitting alone in an apartment that still felt temporary. No matter how many things I unpacked, and somewhere in between 12-hour shifts and quick meals eaten standing up, I applied to a nurse practitioner program at the state university, not because I had some big dream about it, but because I needed something that moved my life forward in a direction that didn't depend on anyone else, and when I got accepted, I didn't celebrate. I just opened my schedule and started figuring out how to make it work: full-time job, full-time school, which on paper sounds unreasonable and in practice feels exactly the same. But I did it anyway because I had already learned that waiting for the right time is usually just another way of staying stuck. So my days became very simple and very structured. Wake up early, study before work. Work a full shift, review notes during breaks. Go home, study again, sleep, repeat. And it wasn't glamorous, it wasn't inspiring, it was just consistent, and consistency, it turns out, can carry you a lot further than motivation ever will. And over the next 2.5 years, I built something that didn't exist before. Not just a degree, but a version of myself that didn't need validation from people who had never given it. And there were moments, small ones, where I noticed the difference. Like the first time I handled a complicated patient case on my own and didn't second-guess every decision, or the first time a colleague asked for my input and actually waited for my answer, and those moments mattered because they were real. They weren't tied to family roles or expectations. They were based on what I could do, not who I was supposed to be. And when graduation came around, I went obviously cap and gown, walked across the stage, shook the dean's hand, smiled for the camera. All the things you're supposed to do. And I remember looking out at the audience rows of people holding flowers, taking pictures, cheering for their kids, their siblings, their partners, and my section was empty, completely empty. And I told myself, it didn't matter that I had done this for me, which was true. But there's a difference between something not mattering and something not hurting. And it did hurt, just not in a way that stopped me, more like a quiet reminder of what wasn't there. And after the ceremony, I went home, ordered takeout, and ate it on my couch with a cat I had adopted 6 months earlier because the apartment felt too quiet without something living in it besides me. And I named her Olive because it felt simple and normal, and that was the kind of life I was building. Simple, controlled, predictable, and over time it started to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like something stable. I got a job at a community health clinic, working with patients who didn't always have the resources they needed but showed up anyway. And there's something grounding about that, being around people who are dealing with real problems in real time. It puts your own situation into perspective without minimizing it, and my coworkers became my circle, not in a dramatic "we're family now" kind of way, just in a consistent, reliable way. We covered each other's shifts, grabbed coffee between appointments, talked about normal things, and that was enough. I didn't need a big social life. I needed something steady, and for the most part I had that, except for certain times of the year when the structure broke down a little and holidays were the hardest, especially Christmas. Because no matter how busy you keep yourself, there's no way to completely ignore the fact that it's a time built around togetherness, and when you don't have that, it shows. So I made a decision early on that I would work every Christmas shift available overnight if possible, because it was easier to be in a clinic with fluorescent lights and a clear purpose than sitting in my apartment listening to neighbors celebrate through the walls. And for years, that's what I did. Signed up for the shift, stayed busy, treated it like any other day, and most of the time it worked. But there were moments, usually late at night, when things slowed down, where I'd catch myself thinking about what it would feel like to have somewhere else to be, somewhere that expected me. And I didn't let those thoughts linger, not because I was avoiding them, but because I had learned how to manage them, acknowledge, then move on. And that became my life, not lonely in a dramatic sense, but solitary, in a very practical way. Everything I needed, nothing I didn't, and for a long time that balance held. I didn't notice it at first, and that's the part that still gets me, because when something shows up quietly and consistently, you tend to file it under normal without asking too many questions. And for me, it started with the deposit, small, regular amounts that showed up in my account every month, labeled through what looked like a financial assistance program connected to rural healthcare workers, and it made sense on paper. I had applied for a few grants when I started the nurse practitioner program. Nothing major, just enough to ease the pressure. So when the money came in, I didn't question it. I used it exactly how it was meant to be used: tuition, books, rent. And I even sent a thank you email to the administrator, listed in the paperwork, because that's how I operate. You acknowledge help when you get it, and the response I got back was polite but vague, which didn't strike me as unusual at the time. Because most programs keep things general, and that was the first piece, something that supported me without asking for anything in return, something that showed up on time every time, like someone had decided I wouldn't have to carry everything on my own, even if I thought I did. And then there were the moments that didn't quite register as connected, like the feeling I had at my graduation, standing there on stage, looking out at a sea of people and thinking for just a second that someone was watching me who I couldn't see, not in a dramatic way, not like I expected anyone to be there, but more like a quiet awareness that didn't have a clear source, and I shook it off because it didn't make sense. And I had trained myself to focus on what was real and in front of me, but looking back now, that feeling wasn't random. It was my brain picking up on something my eyes hadn't fully processed. And then there were the letters, not many, not regular. But every once in a while, I'd find an envelope in my mailbox with no return address, just my name written in a handwriting that felt familiar without me being able to place it right away. And inside there would be a short note, nothing long, nothing overly emotional, just a few lines that said things like, "Keep going, you're doing well," or "I'm proud of the work you're doing," and no signature, no explanation, just enough to make you pause for a second before moving on with your day. And I treated those the same way I treated everything else. I accepted them without digging too deep, because digging too deep usually leads to questions you're not sure you want answered. And at that point in my life, I had built something stable by not looking back, by not reopening doors. I had already closed, so I let it be. I let the deposits come in. I read the notes. I folded them up and put them in a drawer, and I kept moving forward, but there were small details that didn't fully fit, like the timing of certain things, how the deposits aligned almost perfectly with my tuition deadlines, how the notes showed up right after particularly difficult weeks, like someone was paying closer attention than I realized, and I'd catch myself wondering for a second, just a second, who would know enough about my life to do that. And then I'd shut the thought down because the answer didn't seem realistic, not based on everything I thought I knew, and for a long time that was enough. Not knowing was easier than confronting the possibility that I might have been wrong about something fundamental. And then there were the sightings, if that's even the right word, moments that felt too small to take seriously but too specific to ignore, completely. Like once, when I was leaving the clinic late in the evening, and I thought I saw someone standing across the street near a parked truck, just a figure in a coat, nothing distinct, and by the time I looked again, they were gone. And I told myself it was nothing, just someone waiting for a ride or checking their phone, and another time at a grocery store, when I felt like someone had been in the same aisle as me, longer than necessary, not close enough to be obvious. Just present in a way that made me slightly aware without triggering alarm. And again, I dismissed it because I had trained myself not to assume things, not to create stories where there might not be any, and that pattern continued, small, almost invisible threads that didn't connect into anything concrete, just enough to create a background sense that something was there without demanding my attention. And I think part of me accepted it because it didn't disrupt my life. It didn't ask anything of me. It didn't pull me backward. It just existed quietly alongside everything I was building. And if I'm being honest, there was a strange kind of comfort in that, the idea that maybe somehow I wasn't as completely alone as I had believed, even if I couldn't explain why. And years passed like that, me moving forward, building a life that made sense on its own terms, and whatever that presence was, staying just out of focus, consistent but unconfirmed, until the night everything finally came together. And I realized that what I had been interpreting as coincidence, as background noise, as things not worth questioning, were actually pieces of something much more intentional, something that had been there the entire time waiting for me to see it. I had just taken off my coat and poured myself a glass of wine when the doorbell rang, and for a second I thought it was Diane arriving early because she had texted me earlier saying she needed to stop by and talk in person, which already felt unusual, but when I opened the door, it wasn't her standing. There it was, a little girl, maybe 6 years old, bundled up in a winter coat that looked one size too big, holding something tight against her chest, like she had been told not to let go of it under any circumstances, and she looked up at me with these wide, uncertain eyes and said, "Are you Aunt Emma?" And I just stood there because no one had called me that in 8 years, not once, not even by accident. And hearing it out loud in that small voice hit me in a way I wasn't prepared for, like something in my chest had been locked up for so long. It didn't know how to respond, and I said yes. I'm Emma because that was the only part I was sure about, and she held out what she was carrying, a thick worn album held together with a rubber band, and said, "Grandpa told me to give this to you. He said you'd understand." And before I could ask another question, before I could even process how a child I had never met knew who I was, I heard a car door close behind her, and Diane stepped out, her face drawn in a way I had never seen before, like she had been holding something heavy for too long and was finally putting it down. And she walked up the steps slowly and said, "Her name is Sophie. She's Ashley's daughter." And that sentence alone felt like it knocked the air out of me, because it meant that while I had been living my life completely separate from that family life, had been moving on without me in ways I hadn't even considered. And Diane added, her voice quieter, "Now, your father made that album every page. He wanted you to have it, and I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside and let them in. Because whatever this was, it wasn't something you handle, standing in a doorway, and once we were inside, Sophie went straight to the couch like she had done it before, like she was comfortable in a place that had never belonged to her. And I sat down on the floor with the album in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the worn edges, the kind of physical evidence that something had been built over time, not thrown together at the last minute. And I took a breath and opened it, and the first page stopped me immediately. It was a photo, slightly blurry, taken from a distance of a graduation stage, and it took me a second to realize what I was looking at, but then it clicked. It was my nurse practitioner graduation, the one where I had scanned the audience and seen no one I knew, and the photo was taken from the very back row, angled just enough to capture me on stage without drawing attention to the person holding the camera. And I felt something shift, because that meant someone had been there physically, there watching. And I turned the page, and the next photo was me outside the clinic laughing with a coworker taken from across the street through what looked like a car window. And then another page, a receipt, a bank transfer, $200 every month for years, and in the margin, written in handwriting. I recognized instantly, even after all that time, was a note from Dad, and I had to stop because suddenly everything that hadn't made sense before started lining up: the deposits, the timing, the consistency. It wasn't a program. It wasn't anonymous. It was him quietly making sure I had what I needed without stepping into my life in a way that would have exposed him. And I kept going, page after page, Christmas cards handwritten, never sent, each one starting the same way. "Dear Emma, I'm sorry." And I could see the dates, year after year, evidence of something that had been happening in parallel to my life without my knowledge. And then another photo, me working, me walking, me living, all taken from a distance, all from someone who didn't want to be seen. And I realized that every time I had felt like maybe I wasn't completely alone, every time I had dismissed that thought as wishful thinking, I had been wrong. And it hit me all at once, not gradually, not gently, just a full realization that while I had spent 8 years believing I had been erased from that family, my father had been there the entire time, just out of reach, doing what he could within the limits he had. And I closed the album for a second and put my hand over my mouth, because I couldn't keep it together anymore. Not after seeing all of that, not after understanding what it meant. And Diane sat across from me, watching quietly, giving me space without trying to manage the moment. And I finally said, "Why didn't he just call me?" Because that was the question that cut through everything else. And she looked down at her hands before answering, and when she did, it was simple. "Your mother controls everything, his phone, his accounts." She told him if he reached out, Ashley would cut him off from Sophie. And I looked over at the little girl sitting on my couch, flipping through a book like this was any other evening. And I understood, not in a way that made it okay, but in a way that made it real. He hadn't chosen silence because he didn't care. He had chosen the only version of presence he thought he could sustain without losing the one piece of light he still had in his life, and that didn't erase the years. It didn't fix the damage, but it changed the story, and I opened the album again slower this time, taking in each page for what it was. Not just proof, but effort, consistent, quiet effort that I had never seen. And somewhere between those pages, between the photos and the notes and the receipts, something in me broke, not in a destructive way, but in a way that finally let everything I had been holding in come out. The anger, the confusion, the grief, all of it, and I sat there on the floor of my apartment, holding that album while a child I had never met called me aunt, and for the first time in 8 years, I realized that the story I had been telling myself about being completely alone wasn't entirely true. I just hadn't been looking in the right direction. I sat in my car for a full minute with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching people walk into the church like it was any normal Christmas Eve service. Families dressed up, kids holding candles, couples laughing quietly. As they stepped out of the cold, and for a second I almost stayed there. Because walking in meant stepping back into a version of my life I had spent 8 years building distance from. But then I looked at the album on the passenger seat, at my father's handwriting on the cover, and I opened the door and got out, because this wasn't about going back, it was about finally standing in the same space as the story that had been told about me and letting reality exist next to it. And when I walked inside, the warmth hit first, then the sound of music, soft, controlled, the kind of atmosphere designed to make people feel safe and connected. And I kept my head down as I moved to the last row and sat where I could see everything without being seen right away. And there she was, my mother, sitting in the front pew like she belonged there, dressed perfectly, smiling at people as they leaned in to talk to her, and my sister Ashley next to her. Posture straight, attention divided between the room and her phone, and next to Ashley was Mark, her husband, someone I had only heard about but never met, sitting still, watching without saying much. And then the music faded, and Pastor Williams stepped up to the podium and said he wanted to invite Susan Carter to share a few words, and people started clapping, genuine warm applause, the kind you give someone you trust. And my mother stood up, smoothed her blouse, and walked to the front with that same composed confidence she had always used when she wanted to control a room, and when she started speaking, her voice was steady, practiced. Every word placed exactly where it needed to be. She talked about family, about forgiveness, about the pain of loving someone who walks away, and I listened as she described a version of me that didn't exist, a daughter who had left without explanation, who had refused help, who had broken her heart for no reason. And people in the pews nodded, some of them wiping their eyes because the story worked. It always had. It was clean, emotional, easy to believe, and I sat there letting it play out. Not because I agreed with it, but because I needed to hear it one more time in full without interruption. And when she finished, the room filled with applause again, louder this time, supportive, validating everything she had just said, and she stepped down from the podium, turning slightly toward the daughter aisle. And that's when she saw me, and the change was immediate, not dramatic, just a brief pause where her expression didn't match the moment, like a glitch in something carefully controlled. And then she recovered fast, faster than most people would even notice, and she started walking toward me, arms opening, voice rising just enough for people nearby to hear. "Emma, oh my God, you came home." And people turned heads, shifting attention, moving from the front of the room to the back, and I stood up, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just standing there as she reached me and wrapped her arms around me, and I didn't hug her back. My arms stayed at my sides because this wasn't a reunion, no matter how she wanted to frame it, and she leaned in close and whispered, "Don't you dare make a scene, smile." And I almost laughed because even now, even in this moment, she was still trying to direct the outcome, and I stepped back just enough to break the contact and said clearly, calmly, "I didn't come here for that." And the shift in the room was immediate, subtle, but real, people leaning in, paying attention. And my mother straightened slightly, adjusting her expression, trying to keep control, and said louder, "Now we can talk about this at home, not here." And I shook my head and said, "You chose here to tell your version. This is fair." And there was a ripple through the crowd, not loud, just enough to signal that something had changed. And Ashley stood up quickly, stepping toward us, saying, "This isn't the time," but she didn't sound as confident as she probably expected to. And I didn't argue with her. I just reached into my bag and pulled out the album, holding it at chest level, not waving it around, not making a show of it, just letting it exist in the space between us. And I said, "Dad asked me to come." And that was the first crack, small but visible, my mother's expression tightening for a fraction of a second, and I opened the album to the first page and turned it slightly so the people closest to us could see the photo from my graduation, the empty seats, the angle from the back row. And I said, "Did you know he was there?" And the room got quieter, not silent but focused, and I flipped to the next page, the bank transfers, the notes in the margin, and said, "Did you know he's been supporting me for years?" And my mother's voice came in quickly, controlled but sharper. Now that's not true, but it didn't land the way it usually did, because now there was something concrete in front of people, something they could see, and I kept going. Not rushing, not raising my voice, just laying things out one step at a time. And when I got to the last page, I paused, because this was the part that mattered most, and I held up the photocopy of the letter she had written and said, "This is what you told Pastor Williams about me," and I read it not dramatically, just clearly, each line exactly as it was written, the diagnosis, the claims, the concern that never translated into action. And when I finished, I lowered the paper and said, "None of that is true. I left because you told me to stop being dramatic while I was in the ER, losing my baby," and the reaction wasn't loud. It was smaller than that, a collective intake of breath, people processing, recalibrating, and Pastor Williams stepped forward, not hurried, just steady, and said, "I can confirm." I received that letter, and that shifted things again, because now it wasn't just me speaking, it was someone they trusted, adding weight to the truth. And before my mother could respond, Mark stood up from the front pew, and that wasn't something anyone expected, including Ashley, who grabbed his arm and whispered something I couldn't hear, but he pulled away gently and said, "I need to say something." And his voice wasn't loud, but it carried, and he said, "Ashley told me she heard that phone call the night Emma was in the hospital. She heard her ask for help, and she told Susan not to go because the guests were arriving, and that was it." That was the moment everything shifted fully, because it wasn't just evidence, it was confirmation from inside the system. And my mother's composure finally broke, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a sharp, controlled anger that didn't match the role she had been playing all evening. And she said something about being attacked about everything she had done for the community, but it didn't hold, not anymore, because the room had already moved. People weren't looking at her the same way. They were looking at her like they were seeing her for the first time, and I stood there in the middle of it, not feeling triumphant, not feeling vindicated, just steady, because this wasn't about winning, it was about ending a story that had been told without me for too long, and finally, for the first time, being present while the truth stood on its own. I walked out of that church into the cold air and didn't look back, not because I was trying to make a statement, but because there was nothing left in that room for me to fix. The truth had already done its job, and whatever people chose to do with it was out of my hands. And over the next few days, things shifted in ways that didn't feel dramatic on the surface, but carried real weight underneath. My mother didn't call me, didn't show up, didn't send a message trying to explain or rewrite what had just happened. And from what Diane told me, she didn't go back to the church the following Sunday either. Not because she was banned, no one had that kind of confrontation, but because the space she used to control no longer responded to her. The same way people were polite, distant, careful with their words, and when you've built your identity on being the center of a room, that kind of quiet distance hits harder than any direct accusation, and the family followed a similar pattern. Not a clean split, not everyone suddenly choosing sides, but enough hesitation, enough questions, enough "is this true" conversations, that the version of the story she had been telling for years stopped being the only one in circulation, and that was enough to shift the balance, not completely, but permanently. And I didn't involve myself in any of it. I didn't make calls. didn't send messages, didn't try to correct every misunderstanding, because I had already done what I needed to do. I had shown up and told the truth, and after that, my responsibility ended, and instead I drove to the hospital that same night. Because while everything else was unfolding, my father was lying in a bed waiting for a surgery that could either extend his life or cut it short. And when I walked into his room, he looked at me like he wasn't sure I was real, like he had been preparing himself for the possibility that I wouldn't come, and I didn't make it complicated. I didn't bring up the past right away. I just said I got the album, and he nodded, eyes already filling up, and said, "I didn't know if you'd ever see it." And we sat there for a minute, both of us, understanding that this wasn't something you rushed through, and eventually he said I should have been braver, and I didn't argue with him because he was right, but I also said, "You were there because that mattered too, not enough to erase the years, but enough to change how I saw them, and we didn't fix everything in that room. We didn't suddenly become close or pretend the past hadn't happened, but we started something real, something honest. And sometimes that's more important than trying to create a perfect version of reconciliation." And before his surgery, he told me he had been working with a lawyer through Diane quietly for months, setting up a separation, moving his portion of their assets into a trust that would go to me and to Sophie, not as some grand gesture, but as a practical way to make sure my mother couldn't control everything the way she always had. And I remember telling him it wasn't about the money. And he said, "I know it's about her not having that power anymore." And that was the first time I saw him, not as the quiet man at the dinner table who never spoke up, but as someone who had finally decided to act, even if it took him decades to get there. And the surgery went well. Not perfectly, but well enough. And when he woke up, I was there sitting in the chair that had been empty the last time I had been in a hospital bed. And that detail mattered. More than anything either of us said out loud and over the warning. And so, next few weeks, we built something that didn't rely on big gestures, just small, consistent ones. Phone calls once a week, visits when we could manage them. Conversations that stayed grounded in the present instead of getting stuck in the past. And at the same time, my life outside of that continued work routine, everything I had built before, didn't disappear just because something new had been added to it. And then Christmas came around again, and for the first time in 8 years, I didn't sign up for the overnight shift. I stayed home, and my apartment, the same one that had felt too quiet for so long, felt different, not bigger. Not more impressive, just fuller. My father was there, moving slower than he used to, but steady. Sophie was on the floor, drawing completely focused. Diane was in the kitchen doing what she always does, making sure everyone had something to eat. And there were empty spaces, too. My mother wasn't there. Ashley wasn't there. And I didn't try to fill those gaps with explanations or expectations, because not every relationship needs to be repaired to move forward. And that's something I had to learn the hard way. People ask me sometimes if I've forgiven my mother, and the answer is no, not in the way they usually mean. I don't carry anger around all day. I don't replay what happened over and over, but I also don't pretend it didn't matter. Forgiveness, at least for me, isn't about giving someone access back into your life just because time has passed. It's about deciding how much space their actions are allowed to take up in your present. And right now, the space she occupies is very small, intentional, controlled. And I'm okay with that with Ashley. Things are still uncertain. She sent a short message, said she was sorry, and I believe she means it in the way she understands it. But understanding and change are not the same thing, and I told Diane to pass along that I'm open to a conversation when she's ready to be honest, not just apologetic, and if that happens, it happens. If it doesn't, I can live with that too. Because the biggest thing I've learned through all of this is that being related to someone doesn't automatically give them a place in your life. Access is something that gets earned, maintained, and sometimes revoked, and you're allowed to make that decision without explaining it to anyone. And when I look around my apartment now at the people who are there, at the life I built from the ground up without any guarantee it would turn out this way, I don't see something broken that needs to be fixed. I see something real, something chosen. And if there's one thing I want anyone listening to this to take away, it's this: walking away from people who hurt you doesn't make you weak. It makes you honest about what you need to be okay. And if someone shows up later, truly shows up not with words but with actions. You can decide what to do with that when the time comes. But until then, you don't owe anyone a seat at your table just because they used to sit there.